Hey, I'm Jacob Cooperman, and you were watching the MMA Conspiracy Hour with Todd Atkins and Miguel Iturrate. Todd has been involved in covering combat sports since the 1990s, and Miguel has match-made over 200 different events amongst various promotions worldwide. Please subscribe and be on the lookout for future episodes. As for me, you can check me out at Gloves Up on YouTube and Coop TV with 3 O's on Instagram. Thank you guys, and enjoy the episode.
All right, this is Todd Atkins. I'm back with Miguel Iturrate, and as always, we appreciate you guys taking time to support the show. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. I think these videos that we do with Miguel, especially, I don't want to say we're the better than everybody else, but I do think we inform in a way that few people do. There's some good channels out there, but I think from an educational standpoint, uh, there aren't many that do the kind of videos that we do. And with that said, we kind of want to discuss this latest UFC gambling situation, and more along the lines of where the investigation could possibly go or what kind of things could contribute to it. So, Miguel, I kind of want to give you a chance to kind of say your opening thoughts on this.
Oh, we recorded a pretty extensive piece on it when this broke, and um, I think one of the things that I mentioned was that, um, especially the fact is that it's been in the news that they're investigating 100 fights and things like that, and um, the one thing I mentioned is that this is definitely bigger than than we're being led to believe right now. And certain people in the media are casting. They bring up the James Krause name. They bring up Krause's trainer's name. They bring up certain people there, and um, they're looking. And the fighter guy that got, the kid that got cut from the UFC for doing this and that sort of stuff. Um, to me, right now, those guys are firmly casting the Lee Harvey Oswald role as the patsy. They're looking for somebody who's going to take the fall. I kind of mentioned in the other article that I think they're going to find somebody who'll take the fall, and within a certain amount of time, we'll be back to business as usual with the gambling and the gambling entities out there. The fact is that gambling's been around fighting sports since the inception. Um, it is similar to like a club of people that are involved, especially at a high level. We've even you go back a couple of years when we were talking about the UFC fighter lawsuit. We mentioned the possibility of, like, you know, go where does the true I want to bet $1 million on a fight kind of guys go? Like who or I'm going to bet 1 million, and who's going to cover my $1 million bet? Hey, I got a guy in Russia who wants to cover 1 million. Like, where does this type of action actually go down? And I like, does Russian interest bet on Kamzat? You know, because they'd have to put up 5 or 10 million bucks to make $1 million at this point. The way the guy fights, right? Undefeated, kind of with a say, all those Russians, Nurmagomedov, all those guys with sterling records. You'd have, if you wanted to win or bet or chill for ego, you'd have to put up a hell of a lot of money to win back something decent. So where does that action take place? Because you can't do it on, your online phone app at the online casino kind of thing. Um, I remember them capping most betting at $500, 1,000 bucks, maybe $5,000 bucks, maybe after betting for a little while, you get guys that I'll bet a couple 100,000 on an entire UFC event, spread it out among the fights, see how I do, kind of thing. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the millions of dollars that some people might be putting up for this type of thing. In boxing, this is kind of personified by the Daniel Kinahan presence. And what does that? What does he do? What does he do? You know, you've got fights being made that are on TV. That you've got the promoter, you've got the two fighters, everybody signed the contract, and Tyson Fury goes up and says, "Thank you, Daniel." What's his involvement? You know what I mean? I mean, Tyson Fury screwed up by opening his big gap. But again, what is the guy's presence? I think it's probably that there's a group of people, Saudi princes, um, Russian mobsters, uh, British mobsters, American casino owners, et cetera, that roll at a level that the common person doesn't understand. So there's when we talked about that gambling and who's the house for those types of bets, right? So now let's stay on the subject of the current scandal. I think they're looking for a patsy. They're looking for somebody who's going to go down so that they don't look much further. So any idea if the word came from the FBI and there's people on both sides, right? The FBI knows that Dana and the UFC have a spot in the president's heart. So are they going to go full barrel investigating into this? At the same time, you know, it could serve as a smoke and mirrors to hide other things. Like, for example, if people are still pressuring for the Epstein documents and things like that. You hang the UFC out to dry, there's actually something there. But if you hang the UFC out to dry, that'll take up a lot of media time and a lot of investigative time. And again, if there's something there, possibly restore some of the credibility of the FBI. People will maybe forget about the other thing. They're still trying to get people to forget about something. And the UFC, but as big as this scandal could be, it's not going to be. It's not anywhere near the scope of what the other things could be, right? So I think what's changed in the last week to 10 days since our last recording is that rather than a single person like a James Krause or somebody like that might be the fall guy might actually be the entire UFC infrastructure if things are on the up and up in terms of the investigation. What can they find there? I'll present it to you this way. And a few years back, there was a major news scandal that even right now, it's still playing in the media because Bill Burr, Dave Chappelle, like a slew of like top shelf comedians all went to Saudi Arabia to do a show and they all caught hell over it. Well, other bigger comedians stayed out of that, refused the money and didn't go. Why? Because Saudi Arabia is still controversial. And the idea there is that a few years back, an opponent of the regime was called to the embassy in Turkey and members of the security entourage for the crown prince butchered him and hit his body and killed him. And then you have in that kingdom crown prince saying he knew nothing about it. And most people think that's preposterous that he knew nothing about it. But he's so powerful that some of the people who actually physically did the killing may actually have been executed for the entire show of making the prince look innocent. But no one who really is on the know of how things work in that country honestly believe that the crown prince didn't know about that. And I present to you that Dana White is the crown prince of the UFC. Since the very, very beginning, he's always been a control freak, always controlling things. So, and he's a gambling person. We've got hundreds of videos and stories of him gambling, not on MMA, not officially, but not on MMA, but he's a gambler. So now he's going to look up and be like, I had no idea. I can't believe what these guys are doing. It's very disingenuous. And, if they investigate and do find that he knew and looked the other way, or I think the most plausible way the thing gets laid out is that when they bought the UFC, that yeah, he gambled on the fights, and at some point, he realized there was some type of conflict of interest. There was some type of problem. It could actually affect if the boxing commissions are doing their job, and his boss Lorenzo Fertitta was on the boxing commission, right? But it would actually be a conflict of interest for him to be making money off of gambling. He wouldn't list it on his taxes, right? But it could pop up, and it would be a conflict of interest for him to be gambling on some of the fighters and some of the guys, and he would want them to win and not others, and things like that. So at some point, he's probably pulled out of it. But the entire infrastructure around it, the matchmaking, now there's a referee, or at least one referee, that's getting pulled into this heavily with some questionable stoppages and things like that. It goes pretty deep, that little boys club. And again, now you're going to tell me a guy who, you know, Dana's on record there saying he's the only one who really knows MMA. He's the only one. He's the expert. He's the this, that, and the other thing. And now he's going to turn around and go, my God, I had no idea. You decide.
Yeah, the refereeing question, that's actually interesting because Jason Herzog apparently is being looked at. And, Herzog at one point was like the gold standard for referees by a mile. And then all of a sudden it looked like he had no idea what he was doing. You know what I mean? So I can see why this kind of thing would pop up because I think inexplicably over time it started to look like he had no clue what he was doing. He went from the best by a wide margin to having no idea what he was doing. And a lot of some of the decisions he made down the road were really head scratching to say the least. And that's the other thing. These referees, and I had seen somebody bring this up. Forgot exactly who it was. I'm trying to remember. It may have been Hey Jive Picks or somebody like that. But the same referees are used all over the world, even though these places have their own, sanctioning bodies. All these states have their own sanctioning bodies. These countries have their own sanctioning bodies, but you have about four refs, 4 or 5 refs that are used everywhere. You know what I mean? And Dana says, "Oh, it's the commission that picks the refs." Well, it seems like it's the same commission picking them everywhere because
Oh, not only that, but what about who's the commission in Abu Dhabi? Where are they a member of the ABC, the Boxing Commission Alliance, or whatever it is in the states? No, the commissions are only in the states and Canada. But any other place they operate, including in the Middle East, it's no commission. In Brazil,
right.
they have a commission that somebody sharp in Brazil said, okay, this is what they're doing with the commissions in the states. Let's do it here too, right? But you mean to tell me that all the Brazilian guys aren't friends and they don't know each other and they're not? I don't think I think Brazilians are probably
But I'm saying in these other
gambling's
countries,
not
they
in their
have
culture.
MMA events and they have guys that are perfectly capable of being refs for these shows, and they're not being used. It's Dan
Oh,
Mergliotta,
yeah.
Herb Dean, these
The
people
thing
that
about it
aren't very
is
good anyway.
the referees, unfortunately, and this has always been the case, the referees enjoy a B or C class level of celebrity. You know, um, just like if you consider it, and this is funny, a guy who doesn't get mentioned in this, and he's old now, but his brother is in boxing, and they had gambling websites at the very beginning of the craze and stuff like that. And I'm talking about the Buffer brothers. You know, and again, here's the thing: is so why in the world would you bring Buffer to a foreign event? Do you mean to tell me they don't have somebody who can read into a mic with a nice voice? You know, but and I'm not pointing the finger at Bruce, but I do suspect that there's like you said, there's an ecosystem of people there, and somebody like Bruce is in a perfect position to be an insider of knowledge. Hey, I heard this guy was hurt. Hey, I heard this guy, this match here might be suspect. And that type of information goes out there. Again, I have no proof of Bruce doing it, but somebody in his position would be perfect. And then all of a sudden he's at every event. And he's talking to the fighters and he's friends with the fighters and he likes this guy. And he's like, he's like, you know, when he was kind of in his heyday, he would do stupid, you know, kind of childish stuff like, you know, when I announce your name, I'm going to do a double spin, like leaping in the air and spinning while I'm screaming your name, and trying to hype up the event and stuff like that. And but fighters appreciate attention; they appreciate that sort of thing. So the next time out, if you're a little banged up, who knows? And Bruce isn't stupid; he knows enough about fights, having been around him, that you can tell if somebody's off sometimes. So again, these are the referees, even the ring announcers, the matchmakers, all these people. I would have to say, I would suspect they're lying if they're going to deny, like they had no idea that this type of thing was going on.
Yeah, and
It's just,
even Joe Rogan has said that he gambled on UFC fights early in his career. And at some point he stopped because he realized there might be a conflict, of sorts. So he started giving his information to his friend Aubrey. And he's talking about how he had like 84% success rate or something.
here the other part about Rogan is at some point Rogan had something to lose. I mean, he podcast becoming a celebrity in the news and in this type of modern media stuff blew him up. And he's commonly known as the biggest podcast in the world, or the biggest podcast in the States. And he's affected elections and gotten presidents and people like that on there. So he now has something to lose. I think his Spotify deal was a 9-figure deal, right? So now he has something to lose. And he's not dumb, so he doesn't want to lose that. So yeah, of course you pull out of any of the shady information and stuff. But again, he's smart enough that he's got to realize what's going on and who these people are. So yeah, this boys club, we talked about it around the UFC's lawsuit with the fighters, and the idea that the UFC is a monopoly. Okay, now if you add the fact that the fighters don't really have anywhere competitive that they can go and find work in, or if they've, allowed Bellator to continue for a certain amount of time and now allow the PFL to continue struggling along without the aggression that they showed against Pride and against some of the other people in the early days. So they sort of let them go there to keep the facade going. But the fighters had nowhere to go and turn. But it's not until you recognize that they control the management structure of the fighters, that they control the gambling aspect for the fans, that they control the merchandising and the news media and everything, every aspect of the fight. Now you're more into a true monopoly. And that's what Cash Patel, again, like we said, we mentioned the Epstein list, right? So, like the Epstein list, it's like, you know what? The list is dog crap. I don't care. We kind of know the list. You know, Bill Gates is on it. Donald Trump is on it. Bill Clinton's on it. The cripple scientist from England that died is on it. You
Prince
know,
Andrew,
Prince Andrew's on it.
Alan Dershowitz,
Uh, so
yeah,
the
lots
list
of
is
people.
out there. You know, you could drop or add a few names to it or everything like that. But care about the list. The bottom line is where are the prosecutions? And that's where there's nowhere to be found. There's not even one. I mean, I guess Elaine Maxwell went down, and she's the one taking the fall for everybody, right? But there's not a single prosecution coming from that. So now here in the UFC investigation, the UFC paid out money. This is why they are more than glad to pay out the money to the fighters on a payout. First of all, it's not big money to them. And second, it may be hiding what we suspected was monopoly type behavior all along. And part of that is the controlling of the gambling aspect of it, because what is it they say? The house always wins. So somebody's making money off of this, no matter who and what. You know, the gamblers who are in on the in and are betting against, are betting for the guy who's drawing a fight. They're going to make some money, right? The dummies who bet the other way because they don't know and they suspect, oh, this guy's better than that guy, and I'm going to bet my, $50 here, $200 here. It adds up. That's how you get some odds. Those guys are all going to lose their money.
Let's
But
talk a little bit about the ecosystem, that has been referred to a lot because of this antitrust lawsuits. I think is where a lot of this is starting to. I would
right, so
say.
if you
I would say
combine the
because of the.
antitrust, if you
Hold on.
combine
Let
the
me just kind
antitrust
of
investigation, go ahead. I'm
let me
sorry.
finish. I would think if there is an investigation of the ecosystem going on, which people have said there is, I would say it's the antitrust lawsuit that kind of opened the door for this because they've kind of shined a light on this. And so I want to give Miguel a chance to talk about, and this is something that he knows based on, his involvement with other promotions. All these promotions have their own ecosystems, and the UFC has theirs. So I wanted to give him a chance to kind of talk about who these people are and why it could be possible that they might do some underhanded stuff.
So who's the boys club, right? Who are the guys that are on the inside? It's like, all right, this fight's going to go down this way. Get your bets in, you know. And so these guys go out and they make their money off of this and stuff like that. Yeah, I present to you that some of the management of the fighters are going to be involved in this. You know, somebody if there's 100 fights being thrown, there's got to be a guy. It's not, Dana's smart enough that it's not going to be Dana. And Dana may not even know about every fight there. But what I mentioned earlier was like, it's definitely not genuine for Dana to come out and say he had no idea that there was a gambling issue in the UFC. He's been around enough fights too to see that, he'll come out and be like, that was a bad stop. This was now every one of those fights combined with looking at the betting numbers coming in and how the odds moved, all of a sudden becomes suspect, right? So again, I think he knows. I think that the matchmakers may know. I think that the matchmakers, and I don't think this is like, it's interesting, right? Because there's many different aspects of it. Is it here's a fight with a high odds on a guy who we've arranged for the a guy who's favored heavily to go ahead and toss the fight so that the guy that we can bet on the underdog and make big money back. Right? So you have to identify certain fights at a certain point of time. There's 100 of them. It begs the question: is like, okay, are some of these fights the UFC trying to, you know, um, what about the what's the name of the kid from New York who's a pretty good little fighter? He's going to make the title picture. Was a heroin addict. and most people believe he beat Paddy Pimblett?
Oh, Gordon.
Okay. Jared Gordon, right? Yep. Like that fight, like that comes at just the right time for the judges, for everybody to go for Paddy. And now I got to admit, it looks like, again, Ferguson was kind of burnt out when Paddy got him and things like that. But Paddy's held up his own and he's come along in terms of fighting. But when he showed up, he was just another Conor McGregor copycat that had a big mouth and a mouth that wasn't nearly as good as he was. And now maybe, I think he's in a title picture. So he's carried his own weight. But did he need a bump just around the time of that Jared Gordon fight where they had to make sure that he kept winning? So does the UFC actually at some point worry about certain guys and certain career trajectories and certain guys that make them money? Because there's no doubt that Paddy gets them eyes in England, you know? Aspinall too, but not like Pimblett, right? At the time, and you know, they'd already lost McGregor. They need another guy like that. This kid looks like he's got the talk. He's got a certain interesting. Like if I remember my P's and Q's correctly, like his mom is a big fan. She paints herself orange for his fights, and uh, it's like he's got family backing, and and the Brits back their guys, right? So I think the British fight fan is a much more serious fight fan than the American fight fans, right? So it's important for them to have that guy. Was the Jared Gordon fight something that the judges were leaning a certain way, and that the UFC is making certain decisions on who's going to win and lose? In other words, is there a script? There's an interesting video. Derek Lewis is kind of one of those guys that you don't know. Um, you don't know if he's goofing with you or not. You know what I mean? Because he's kind of one of those guys that has a sense of humor. I think he's a lot smarter than he likes to play dumb, but he's not dumb. I think he's been around long enough that he knows the way things go on. And just earlier today, I watched a video where I think he was with Ariel Helwani, and he told Helwani, the UFC is scripted. Again, you don't know if he's up there. I don't know. It's hard to say because it was just a short clip I saw. I don't know if he was goofing, if he retracted that or later or whatever, but he came out and said it. Does the UFC have a script? And then on top of that, because the UFC has a script, now other gamblers feel the comfort level of being able to approach a fighter and say, throw a fight so I can make some money. I'll throw you some money. Who does that? It's probably the managers who are there for every fight, who are there with a group of fighters, et cetera, who go to the fighter and say, listen, this is what you're going to do. And this is why, because it's good for your career and we're all going to make money, or at least you're going to make, this is the benefits to you and why you should do it. Somebody has to explain that to the fighters, right? Now, a guy that owes money and, has a kid on the way and has a mortgage to pay and is making 10 and 10, okay, it's pretty easy to see why he would maybe look, be open to this. But again, who's going to explain? In the way this works, the guy who's at the betting window making a bet on the fight is not the guy explaining to the fighter why he needs to go ahead and take a dive in the fight. There's somebody who's got to explain that to him. And I think it's these management groups that are now kind of exclusive UFC management groups. You can't get into the UFC unless you belong to Iridium or some of these other companies that are out there now. Any other management was absolutely crushed. And we may or may not have mentioned Monty Cox yet, but Monty was the original manager that had a little bit of power and had a stable of strong fighters. The UFC didn't like the kind of power he had. So they did everything they could to chop his legs out and to chop the legs out from under anybody else who had that pseudo manager ability, that role. not deal with them. And then they set up these management companies. And now these management companies are the ones that bring to the fighter. And my experience with Iridium, I live in Costa Rica, I live in Central America, and there are probably the fight game is maybe a decade or more behind the level of what it is in the States, right? But if you look at the example of boxing, you know, Mexico's not the only place with boxers. Nicaragua's got superior boxers. Argentina's got superior boxers. There are boxers in Colombia. There are boxers in Venezuela that have impacted on the world level. There have been boxers, so the Latinos can fight. So I was approached by ONE FC about trying to contact a few of the Latino fighters that were on the up and up. Now, ONE FC is kind of almost too strict with what they request. They want guys with perfect records, local titles, and really no blemishes. If they were 10-1, they would pass. Well, trust me, the guys who are perfect in Latin America were all already signed and had all already been reached out to by these UFC management companies. And they were told the only way you're going to get into the UFC is by hitting us. And guess what? The 10-1 guy that one didn't want, they had him too. And it turns out that a lot of those guys were signed since they were 2 and 3-0. And when there was one guy or two guys, there's a couple of these guys in the U.S. too. Maybe, a good example of this from the old days is a guy like Jake Shields, who Jake had a real good talent, a real good camp with his jiu-jitsu and associated with the Diaz brothers and stuff like that. He understood the business, but at the end of the day, his management up until, rest in peace, his father passed away, but his management was done by his father. So you've got some people that kind of have that, I want my family taking care of me, and those guys kind of don't get anywhere anymore. So you identify a few of these guys, and I had one guy from Chile that had a nice MMA record, and he was not managed by Iridium yet. And when I moved his name forward, I got a phone call from Iridium. And they signed him. They got the guy. And I mean, at this point, the one contract and one's promises of making debuts in the States and stuff like that are all broken anyway. So they PFL is a better option than ONE for most fighters at this point. So good for them. Iridium actually had a better offer for him, but Iridium is playing a safety game of signing everybody they can for 2-0, 3-0 contracts. So a 2-0, 3-0 guy could turn into a 3-3 guy at some point. Then Iridium can cut him, or doesn't get him fights, or doesn't do anything, or he's not going to be in the UFC. So they let him keep fighting on the local circuit. I don't know if he sends 10% or whatever to them anyway, in hopes and dreams and stuff. But they lock up fighters on an international level with the promise of, this is the easiest and best way to get to the UFC. First, we'll get you on Dana White's show. And then, from there, you're in the door and you've got the UFC as a possibility. So, again, so these management guys control these people from the very beginning. They show their power. I'm going to get you into the UFC. Boom, you're in the UFC. Now you're 4-0, 7-0, or 7-1. And one of these guys approaches you and says, guess what? You're at the point in your career where you're not going to get cut with a loss. And if we can somehow make it the fact of the matter is one of the number one, aside from the betting numbers coming in, one of the big problems with this fight that recently went down is that the guy did a piss poor job in tapping out, he didn't even make it look good. What if you had guys that are a little bit better actors and nobody suspects that the fight is, how many of those are going down? How many have they gotten away with because the fighter does a better job than this guy did? So again, and then who's the communicating factor to the fighter? So again, the guy at the betting window, and obviously in this last fight, they talk about millions of dollars in bets coming in the last couple of hours or something like that in the last couple of hours for the underdog in that fight. So it's multiple people that are being made aware. So the network got, hey, this is going down. Hey, this is going down. Bet this guy. Bet this guy. And that communication network of people starts to talk, and everybody's running to the cash window. So it wasn't the first guy at the window that talked to the fighter. Who talks to the fighter? Who's the guy who told him to do this? So yeah, there's an ecosystem there. I hinted at it in the last podcast where there's a lot of people that are probably like cockroaches when you turn on the lights, scattering and don't want to get in any of the spotlight on them, because in a year to 18 months, when this dies down, they'll be right back to business as usual. Maybe if they tie this in with the monopoly investigation and the fighter pay investigation and all the other egregious actions that the UFC has taken over the years to quell competition and things, then maybe something serious goes down.
All right. And maybe we could talk. I mean, I know you talked about kind of the ecosystem in general, but we didn't really talk about the fact that there, without getting into specifics, because we don't need to make, unlike some shows, we don't want to make accusations on people, but there are some pretty close relationships in the center circle. Besides the fact, I mean, they're already close in general, from a business standpoint, but there's some close relationships because of this Vegas bubble, that isn't necessarily that big. The Vegas, the city of Vegas, the Sin City bubble, so to speak, MMA bubble. The community of MMA in general in the U.S. is not that big of insiders. There's fans, but people that are really inside. And then when you get to Vegas, it's even smaller, way smaller. So maybe kind of talk about that a little bit, about the UFC ecosystem, so to speak.
Well, it's like we started this podcast out with. It all starts with Dana, right? So Dana is the godfather of the whole thing. He controls the whole thing, and when he says that he doesn't know or he's so shocked about this, I called the FBI right away. That's exactly what I would do. Even if I knew it, I would call them and just play that card, giving them all the information they need so that the fighter, and this one goes down, and that they don't look much further. So, how do we know? Examples of him controlling everything from the beginning. When he arrived, and Bob Meyerowitz sold the company, really the highest ranking official that went from SEG to Zuffa was Joe Silva. And I'm not sure if he was the matchmaker quite yet, or if he was on his way to being the matchmaker because Peretti wasn't going to play. Peretti was the SEG's matchmaker, and Peretti had an offer on the table to buy the UFC along with another sponsor. So I don't know if, and John is kind of a unique individual himself. I don't know that he would have wanted to work with Zuffa. So somewhere along there, Joe Silva became the matchmaker, and Joe cut his teeth. Had been there for a couple of dozen UFCs, advising the old group, and kind of knew the fighters and knew everybody. So he was well suited for the role. And if you look back at UFC 30, 31, like the early Zuffa UFCs, you could actually find, maybe even in Full Contact Fighter, some of the old documentation from that era, news and things, websites and things. Joe Silva would do interviews. Joe Silva would talk about what he thinks about this or what he thinks about that. And at some point, Dana crushed that. and you had to go to Dana. And Dana became the only face of the UFC and the only person that appears speaking for the company. Now, the matchmaker probably should, except for in the scenario that I think is plausible, is that Joe really was a purist, a good guy, and he was, you know, now he had his dream job, but he had to dance with the devil to do it, and I think he probably, you know, did the best he could at the job, let whatever went on above him, like it's out of my pay scale, out of my pay range, sort of thing. The big guys decide certain things, like who gets the title shots and things like that. I think Joe probably went to bat for a lot of people early, of like who gets the title shot and why this guy deserves it over this guy. But the marketing machine of the UFC chose, certain aspects of who was going to get pushed, and Joe started to not get uh, what he wanted every time, right? Now, the big chink in Joe Silva's armor, because at the beginning they really needed Joe. They really had nobody, they really did need Joe, but then they start to need Joe less and less. And, you know, I saw this happen to me at Bodog too. It's like all of a sudden the company bosses come and say, "Hey, Miguel, we're going to put this guy here in your fight department." It's like, what do I need him for? So when the UFC bought the WEC, the media and everybody was fed the lines of, this is the inauguration of the 145-pound, 135-pound, 125-pound weight classes, and the wedding of the two companies created the full weight class package that the UFC has now, right? And that's kind of what was sold. What happened behind the scenes was that Joe Silva was told, "Oh, we're going to keep the WEC's matchmaker. You don't have to, it's too much work for you. You don't have to matchmake the lower weight class." That is a fatal blow to Joe Silva. And to be honest with you, if things are going to be done all along across the board in the same style, I dealt with every weight class. I don't feel like I needed help. Because it's too many matches to make. Please, bringing in other matchmakers was a death knell to Joe Silva and Joe Silva's style of doing things. And the new guys are part of this Vegas infrastructure that are friends with the Iridium management teams. People can look it up, but there's dozens of stories about, wife swapping and swinger clubs that they're all part of. Neither here nor there. I mean, I don't care what you do morally; it doesn't matter. But that's kind of how some of these boy club bonds get made, between the management companies and the matchmakers, and why, if the matchmakers, or let's say the management companies, decide to take the next step and then maybe mix a fight in here and there that are suspect, why the matchmakers would look the other way, why the matchmakers wouldn't call it out. Because again, if you're matchmaking, you assume you've got some level of expertise on the sport, right? So you see enough of these fights, like Dana's like, I saw the fight. We got a call from the FBI a couple hours before. I called the fighter. I asked him if he owed money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The minute I saw the fight, I was on the phone to the FBI. Why? Because Dana saw that the guy did a bad job in the work. So you would assume that the matchmakers would also have that level of savvy, that they would be like, "Wow, that fight, I don't know about that one. What was that?" Why did judges go that way? Was something going on? Are you talking to the judge? That's the infrastructure, looking the other way. But again, when you get people who tell you that they're the experts on the sport, that they're the only ones who know what's going on the sport, now they're going to turn around and say, I had no idea this was happening.
Yeah, it is pretty comical, that someone who has that much control, but also has the only expertise of anyone in the world, um, would not have the expertise to know what's going on in their own organization. And
Listen,
when the how can I what's the word I want to use? When it's so widespread, this isn't just gambling. They're bringing in refereeing into this, things like that. So it's not like it's just a couple of gambling fights. This is uh, it's widespread amongst the entire organization. And to act like you have no idea when you're the only expert in the sport, the only one who knows the business, but you really don't know your own business is kind of comical.
right,
Yeah.
listen to Dana in interviews when he shits all over anybody else who's got an opinion or anybody else's guy. They don't know anything. I'm the only expert in the sport. He said it. He's on record as saying that in many interviews. So now all of a sudden he's like, I had no idea about this. Really, then the bottom line is that TKO should fire him. It's happened on his watch. He could beat his wife and not get fired. Maybe this is what gets him fired, is that a huge gambling scandal is going on his watch, and either he knows about it, is looking the other way, which is could be fired, or he's too dumb to have realized that it's going on, which ask him if he's dumb. He'll tell you he's not, right? But then again, then doesn't it ring really disingenuous for him to say, I had no idea about this?
Yeah, not only is he not dumb, he's the smartest guy in the room. Everyone else is stupid in comparison. So,
And it's funny, I mentioned a few names here that are maybe probably not involved in this, but could be because of what we're talking about, the ecosystem and stuff like that. We're talking about people who start with knowing information, and then maybe somebody oversteps their bounds. Then how do they get $1 million in bets at the window in the last couple of hours before the fight? Because people are texting, people are making phone calls. There's a wave of information goes out there. I got a hot one for you. And there's been people like this all over the UFC. What was the name of the judge who considered himself another genius? Another genius here. What was the judge that used to write Chael Sonnen scripts?
oh God, I forgot the guy's name, but
Yeah,
yeah.
a guy like you. You mean to tell me a guy like that, if he was let in on this, wouldn't feel like, hey, I'm inside. I know this. And just based on ego and what we know, isn't it plausible that he might be one of the information givers? People hanging around the U.S. That's what you need, is people hanging around. You don't want to miss a beat, right? So it's like, who do you call? It's like, oh man, who do we got on the ground there? We got one of the judges, the ref, Paul Herzog. Paul Herzog. This is how this type of thing happens. There's an NBA ref in jail, and again, that is what last podcast I suspected would happen here. Not that Herzog was going to go to jail, but that there would be a fall guy. But you now, so one ref went to jail, and now all of a sudden, a few years later, you've got head coaches and active players going down in the investigations. So then it wasn't just an isolated incident. It was an infrastructure, a ecosystem in the NBA of people. Again, why throw the games, right? Somebody's got to benefit, right? So somebody's got to go out there and put the action in there so that the books say, "Uh-oh, we got a lot of money coming in on the wrong side of this one. What's going on here?" Um. So yeah. So there's. It starts with information and the people who give information and people who'll say that. Some people might give information and not bet, not gamble, not know the end result. So the guy they're telling tells another guy, and that guy makes it. But yeah, there's a rot in the ecosystem of the sport. If you can find 100 fights in the last short period of time that are suspect enough that the FBI is looking into them.
Now, where do you think this goes? That might be hard to say, but where do you think it goes?
Well, last podcast I presented to you the idea that there would be. I still think this would probably be the case. I'd be surprised if this becomes a wholesale accounting and like they unearth everything. I think that there'll be a certain piece of the disease that stays, and it'll metastasize again in a few years while when people have forgotten about this. In other words, that there'll be certain fall guys. We've already seen fighters lose their contracts. Herzog may never work again. There may be one or two other people involved. Maybe it extends itself further. Maybe they catch a manager involved because, you know, 100 fights. Um, you know, there's got to be some people communicating there, and even if 25% of those fights are actually suspect, it's still 25 fake fights or predetermined outcome fights, right? So it's a big problem. But I still think that we'll see some people go down, and I think they'll somehow manage to avoid a wholesale accounting. Like I said, if you look at it in our comparison, um, you know, people are perfectly content to take the Saudi prince's money. Comedians, golfers, all kinds of people will take the money and look the other way over what is probably, you know, murder. And um, yeah, I think that he set it up so that he can deny it, and you know, it becomes hard to just come out and say he's lying when you don't really have proof. And I think that Dana's probably set up and protected in the same way that it'll be hard to convince the logical thinker that Dana doesn't either Dana knows or he doesn't know, and either way he should probably lose his job, right? But he's going to make it look like he doesn't know, and therefore he's not going to lose his job, and business as usual because he's still going to want his people in his places and stuff, and we see that this stuff pops up and grows.
Fascinating stuff as always. You know, it's going to be interesting to monitor. You know, kind of.
Oh yeah, this is
some of
this
the
is now this is like after the UFC lawsuit had some aspect of interest in that. Like we were interested in it for a little while. We were watching it and following it. Then when the settlement comes, I became very disappointed because it didn't amount to anything, including no change of business practices and things like that. Yeah, there are more lawsuits coming up and stuff, but I think that the UFC was going to get away with throwing money at that. And I sort of lost interest in following that when they settle again or whatever is the next step in whenever that comes up. We may do a recording on it and stuff like that, but I'm not actively worried about. But this, if you could pull this and tie this into that and start looking at all of the activity as a whole, then there may be some type of window for change, but it's just not a lot of precedence for that type of activity. I think um it'll be very painful to certain people. It'll and fall guys and patsies will materialize, and there won't be much that can be done. Keep in mind, at some point in boxing, there were no boxing commissions, right? And then all of a sudden, the boxing commissions were supposed to organize everything. And you've got the gamblers and all those people became boxing commissioners. You know, so they're on the inside already. You know, and again, it's a pervasive infrastructure. Like we said, the number of people that could be part of this, or could be drive-by people, in and out. They know this guy. They talk to this guy. There could be more than one organizer. There's probably more than one organizer of a fake fight. Because once you catch wind, what was that fight? Who did that? Oh, They set this fight up, told the guy to take the loss. Well, I do the same with some of my guys. Let's make some money over here. And who is the organizer, the seed, the guy who says, this fight here, we want him to lose the fight? There's probably more than one person making that decision. It's not just one. So, yeah, that's what's fascinating.
Real quick, any comments on this upcoming Dana White gambling gambling documentary on Netflix? The timing of it seems interesting.
Yeah, I hope it comes out, first of all, right? I guess if it gets pulled, then that could be some type of sign. I don't know what sign that is, but if it gets pulled and he doesn't want to be associated with gambling, if Dana is Dana on this show and we watch it on Netflix, and everything we know about him, you watch the arrogance, and you watch the strut, the confidence that he has around gambling, and you tell me that he's not in the role of the Saudi prince here, that he doesn't know gambling is going on in his sport, and gambling has affected the outcomes of certain of his fights. Just it doesn't match up. So you watch him and his behavior in that, or is it made into some type of documentary where they dumb down everything we know about Dana to make him look a little more innocent? Is this used as a PR move? So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what goes on there. There's a whole half-hour segment of it where he's talking about how he doesn't get involved in MMA or any of that, or doesn't talk to line makers, or doesn't do any of the betting on that sport because it's not ethical, right? Dana talking about ethics, that'd be really interesting.
Yeah, it'll be interesting if anybody watches this show that's involved in that. Maybe they put that into the documentary to kind of dumb it down. I'm not saying that they would get that idea. No,
I think
Dana has his own handlers that would come up with that.
Yeah, I think Dana has enough. He's become a celebrity, like beyond just MMA at this point. And I think this is an ego trip that he would allow a Netflix documentary on this to do. And to be honest with you, even with all of that, he should probably have done something more like Cribs than the show about gambling. It would have just been smarter.
Yeah, I think it's a great thing to close on. It'll be interesting to see if there's any kind of small drip of stuff that comes out. So we'll have to see and monitor it. As always, people watching the show, we appreciate you taking time to watch this and support our episodes, especially Miguel's on. And make sure to like the episode, subscribe, share the stuff with other people. And Miguel, as always, I appreciate your time. It's always fascinating to hear your thought processes, your input on some of these topics.
Yeah, this is, they got my attention again. I'm interested in seeing how this plays out.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to monitor it. And everybody checking this out, we appreciate your time. We appreciate you supporting the show. And be on the lookout for further developments in this and more episodes. See you later.
Hi, I am Nick Dilly, and you are now watching the MMA Conspiracy Hour with Todd Atkins and Miguel Iturrate for conspiracies, combat sports, and so much more. You better stay tuned, or I'll come find you. Night Queen style.